Hello, Ravagers and the Ravenous. My name is Tibius Guy, and we are still in the ongoing process of taking a look at, commenting on, and cataloging the earliest champions of League of Legends in order to take stock of where they are now, almost a decade into the game's lifespan. And in that process, we have finally reached one of the true OGs of League of Legends, the very first Void champion that was ever added to the game. We are going to be figuring out what is the deal with Cho'gath. Now, say it with me, kids. Cho'gath was released into the game in 2009 with a certain amount of lore, and that lore was never expanded upon, and then the 2014 lore retcon happened, so he had to have the League of Legends itself scrubbed from his lore, but then 4 years after the lore retcon happened, he has never received any updated lore that brings him into a modern conception of what the League of Legends universe is like. In that sense, he is very much like many of the older champions we've been taking a look at already. But there are a few twists and turns when it comes to Void champions like Cho'gath, and indeed their relationship to the Void, but also just their relationship to the narrative of League of Legends that make him a little bit more interesting to talk about, perhaps, as we shall, I hope, see. Now, Cho'gath has not been completely without any updates, of course, since he released into the game. He's had a texture update to his model, he's had some VFX updates to his abilities. I believe that those weren't on the PPE very recently. And he's received a new splash art, which you are looking at right now. We'll be looking at the old splash art as well for a reason that will become apparent. The only new lore content he has ever received is this little bit here, which is just a little blurb for his champion page that brings him just very slightly more into line with the modern conception of the Void. From the moment Cho'gath first emerged into the harsh light of Runeterra's sun, the beast was driven by the most pure and insatiable hunger, a perfect expression of the Void's desire to consume all life. Cho'gath's complex biology quickly converts matter into new bodily growth, increasing its muscle mass and density, or hardening its outer carapace like organic diamond. When growing larger does not suit the Void spawn's needs, it vomits out the excess material as razor-sharp spines, leaving prey skewered and ready to feast upon later. This is a conception of Cho'gath that falls into line with the modern conception of the Void, but it was not always so. This right here is Cho'gath's original lore, the lore with which he released into the game in 2009, except for a few changes. You can see it here, it's archived on the Wikia. Cho'gath's original lore, he only ever had one lore state, is pretty much, with a few changes and exceptions, the same as the one we see on his biography page right now. The only thing that's really been changed is that some references to the League of Legends itself have been purged, and there's been like just a few changes to sort of to provide some kind of conclusion to his bio rather than just doing this little bit here. And this makes it the oldest extant description of the Void and its relationship to Runeterra that we have, which makes it interesting. There is a place between dimensions, between worlds. To some it is known as the outside, to others it is the unknown. To those that truly know, however, it is called the Void. Despite the name, the Void is not an empty place, but rather the home of unspeakable things, horrors not meant for minds of men. Cho'gath is a creature born of the Void, a thing whose true nature is so awful most will not speak its name. Its fellows have been poking at the walls that divide dimensions for a crack, a way into Runeterra where they can visit their own personal paradise of horror upon the world. They are called the Voidborn, creatures so ancient and terrible that they have been removed from history altogether. It is rumored that the Voidborn command vast armies of unspeakable creatures on other worlds, that they were once driven from Runeterra by powerful magic lost to antiquity. So, the Void has always been this sort of Lovecraftian horror dimension outside of the knowledge of man or beast on Runeterra. It's always been this sort of amorphous other place from which horrors can be drawn into the world, but the relationship between the Void and Runeterra has changed a lot since the earliest days of the game. Now, in the earliest days of the game, as you can see here, the Void is the home of unspeakable things, horrors not meant for the minds of men. And he has a true nature so awful, most will not speak its name. And his goal, alongside all the other horrors of the Void, are to find a way into Runeterra where they can visit their own personal paradise of horror upon the world. And, Cho'gath, an alien creature of malice and violence, causes all but the most stalwart to cringe in fear. Cho'gath appears to feed on predation, growing and swelling. Worse yet, the creature is intelligent. This is a very different version of the Void than the one we have today. This is a version of the Void that has more in common with, like, the old gods of Lovecraftian myth, certainly, but also somewhat more in common with, for instance, the Warp from Warhammer 40,000, which acts as a sort of version of the idea of hell. This other place that is occupied entirely by horrifying entities that embody some of the worst qualities of mortal creatures. In Cho'gath's case, he wants to enter Runeterra to visit his own personal paradise of horror upon the world. He's driven by malice and violence. He's driven by evil, right? Evil, as we understand it as human beings, is part of his motivation. He wants to consume, he wants to hurt people, he wants to destroy things, and he takes pleasure in doing so. And in that sense, he's not really very different from, like, our typical conception of what a demon is, certainly in, like, a Western Judeo-Christian mythologies, where, like, demons are these evil things that are evil because they're evil, and they do evil because they enjoy evil for evil's own sake. The modern conception of the void in League of Legends, however, has lost that particular dimension to itself. It has transitioned from this kind of, the void as a dimension of evil horrors to a dimension of cosmic nihilism, essentially. It went from like cosmic evil to cosmic nihilism. In the modern conception of the void, Runeterra and the entire physical universe that Runeterra inhabits is not so much an object of desire or something that the void wants to break into and visit a personal paradise of horror upon, as it is an intolerable existence that they want to erase. In the modern conception of League of Legends lore, the void existed forever. Like, it has no beginning, it has no end, it has no time. And there were consciousnesses and entities in the void, but they had no reason to become sentient, to be roused by anything, because the void was eternal, the void was uniform, and nothing ever changed in the void. Then the physical universe comes along. Runeterra and its entire physical universe comes along, and its existence, its sheer nature as being a thing that is not the void, begins to cause changes within the void. Like, the presence of this thing that is not the void forces the consciousnesses in the void to become aware of themselves. It forces them to become aware that there is something that is not them. And that realization, that presence of an other thing than us, becomes this intolerable nail down the chalkboard of their minds. It becomes this annoyance, this thing that they cannot tolerate the existence of. But and so they seek to destroy the physical universe. They seek to invade it, and they seek to convert it into more of the void, because they cannot tolerate that something exists which is not them. But they are not driven by malice or evil. Like, they don't know what those things are. They are not really bound by any human conceptions of morality. They are just doing the only thing that they can do, which is to visit themselves upon all things that are not them. And this is reflected in the way that the Voidborn are portrayed in the modern League of Legends lore. If you remember the Watcher in the Void story that we did a little while back, which was released in conjunction with some Freljordian lore updates, specifically this one was released for Lysandra as part of sort of her reconception in the power structure of Freljord, where we got the story of people descending into one of the Void Rifts that are on Runeterra, with this one being in the Howling Abyss, to check on whether the creatures that were imprisoned down there have begun to find a way to break through, and they are. And here we see the void conceptualized more as a sort of cosmic cancer, essentially. Anyone who comes into contact with void matter on Runeterra becomes instantly infected and becomes corrupted and converted and become used as fuel for the void to spread itself into Runeterra. They become converted into Voidborn, they become converted into void tendrils that take over the area around them and use any biological material that they can get their hands on to fuel more growth for themselves. Which is something that we see sort of prototyped in Cho'gath, who also is very much about consuming physical matter to engorge himself and become larger, but which is conceptualized in a very different way with the void as we see it in Acathia and as we see it in the modern conception of the thing. Again, here, the horror of the void is not so much that they are evil and want to kill you, so much as it is that they don't care if you live or die. They just, oh, that's useful biological material, we're going to grab that, and then we're going to grab whatever other useful biological material we can find nearby, and we don't care if it's sentient, we don't care if it's alive. So, all of this is to say that Cho'gath is an awkward fit in the modern conception of the void, because he's still very much stuck in that old sort of hedonistic demon conception that the void used to have. In fact, he is in his conception, and certainly in his voice lines, a lot closer to characters like Tahm Kench or Evelyn are, in the sense that he is representative of a very human conception of evil. Tahm Kench representing greed, and Evelyn representing lust. Well, Cho'gath might just well represent gluttony, if you want to do the 7 deadly sins conception of of what the characters can be. And that's something he shares with another Void champion, Kog'Maw, who is also just very much about consuming. Consuming with no thought for anything else, just consuming endlessly for no other reason except that that is what he does. The difference between Cho'gath and Kog'Maw, however, is that Cho'gath is intelligent. Cho'gath has the capacity to make choices and the capacity to, form plans and stuff like that. And that is what puts him closer to Evelyn and Tahm Kench than Kog'Maw, who's more like a tiny force of nature, essentially. Like this tiny, adorable thing that just goes around and consumes and doesn't know why and doesn't take any particular sort of intellectual joy in it. It just does so because that's the only thing it knows how to do. So, how do we conceive of Cho'gath in a modern conception of the Void? Like, how do we turn him into something that works with the modern conception of the Void in League of Legends? And is that even really possible in the end? I'm not so sure it is. So this is Cho'Gath's character design. This is what he looks like in the splash art of the modern conception of the game. This is what he actually looks like in the game, and this is his old original splash art. The reason we're looking at all 3 versions of it is because, again, we see a little bit of a reflection of the changes in conception of what the Void is. This version of Cho'Gath right here looks a lot more explicitly demonic than this version of Cho'Gath here. Here, he is insectoid. He looks like some kind of Zerg creature from a StarCraft video game, essentially. He looks like an alien from some other place, somewhere in the cosmic hierarchy of the world. Here, he looks like a demon straight out of hell. And that's not exactly a coincidence, because this is the Violator from Spawn, which is a comic that is drawn by American artist Todd McFarlane, which deals with the adventures of a character called Spawn, who is a kind of elite assassin from hell, and one of the characters in that particular version of in that particular story is the Violator, who is another demon from hell, and that is hell as in one of the Christian conceptions of hell as this, fiery misery dimension where everybody suffers and everyone who's evil goes there for punishment, that kind of thing. That's the Violator. That's Cho'Gath. Violator, Cho'Gath. Violator, Cho'Gath. Violator, Cho'Gath. Cho'Gath, Violator, Cho'Gath, Violator, Cho'Gath, Violator. Cho'Gath is the Violator, is what I'm trying to get at here. He's very much a takeoff of that exact kind of creature design. Cho'Gath as a character is originally based on a conception of a demon from hell in a very popular American comic book. I don't know, I mean, I'm willing to accept the idea that maybe the visual reference is more accidental than an intentional copy. But the early League of Legends game did have a little bit of a share of tendency towards just kind of copying popular concepts in pop culture, let's put it that way. Take a look at how Ashe lines up with the original Drow Ranger, for example. I'm not gonna allege copyright infringement or anything like that, but Cho'Gath's design is very much based off the same idea as the Violator from Spawn, and that, I think, is also where he got his tendency towards the hedonistic suffering, taking pleasure in the suffering of others kind of conception that very much marks the way that his voice lines and his lore is portrayed currently in the game. If you wanted to update Cho'Gath into something more appropriate to the modern state of the Void, you would kind of have to go more towards, I think, someone like Rek'Sai, someone who is animalistic and mindless rather than having any kind of intelligence behind it that can take pleasure in what it does. Or someone like Kha'Zix, who is sort of single-mindedly focused on a single overriding biological imperative. In Cho'Gath's instance, rather than evolving, it would be consuming. Those might be ways in which to modernize the character into the game, but really, if I were to propose a way to change Cho'Gath into something more appropriate to the modern state of League of Legends, I would lean into the idea that maybe he isn't a void creature in the modern conception. Maybe he's a lot more like one of the ancient demons of hell. Maybe Cho'Gath is more like Tahm Kench and Evelyn. Maybe he's better suited to embodying those sort of human foibles and fallacies, human sins, in the same sense that Evelyn and Tahm Kench do. If I had the power to do it, I would reconceptualize Cho'gath entirely as another demon in the pantheon of demons in League of Legends. I would take away the void angle entirely. And I would remake his character design a lot also to more emphasize his mouth and less emphasize, his claws and sort of the ripping and tearing demon from hell kind of thing, and turn him more into this all-consuming maw that stalks the world and does nothing but eat and consume. I think ultimately that would be more true to his original conception as a character than trying to hold on to the idea that he's a Void champion. I don't really think being a Void champion does that much for him. In that sense, he's pretty much the same as Kog'Maw and Kha'Zix, and he doesn't really add anything to that dimension where, of course, as a demon, he still runs into this idea that Tahm Kench is already someone who likes to eat people alive, which Cho'gath, he would kind of infringe upon that particular idea. But there is a difference between them in that Tahm Kench is a greed demon. He tempts people with greed. He tempts people with things that they can't have, and then once they're sufficiently miserable, he consumes them because he eats misery. He eats human misery and suffering. He doesn't really eat people in the sense of consuming their physical material to add to his own bulk. He's not about eating people to grow fat in the same way that Cho'gath is about eating people to grow larger. There's enough of a difference there that I think you could contextualize the two different from each other. But the simple fact of the matter is, no matter how you conceptualize Cho'gath, he's gonna step on someone else's thematic territory, because the concept that Cho'gath represents, the idea of someone consuming to empower themselves, has been done multiple times in League of Legends, as we've already discussed multiple times. So, it's a difficult thing to kind of solve if you want to keep him completely unique within League of Legends, and so I think you kind of have to give up on that idea and just kind of lean into making him a different version, a sufficiently different and interesting version of a concept that's already present in the game. Either way, I'm not really attached to the idea of Cho'gath as a Void champion specifically, because he doesn't really fit into that concept. The Void has not really, in the modern conception of the game, has been much more about the skittering hordes of Voidlings. It's been a lot more about this snaking infection carving its way across Runeterra, just eating whatever physical material it can to extend its own growth and create more Void creatures. It's much more about swarm tactic. It's much more about this overwhelming horde of horrors from beyond the stars and other dimensions, rather than being about this single giant creature that consumes all in its path. It's the difference between a juggernaut and a swarm of locusts, right? Where the modern conception of the Void is much more in the locust area, and the old conception of the Void allows for creatures like Cho'gath, who are to a much greater extent about, I want to grow big, I want to become large, I want to become, the biggest possible threat to everything. Cho'gath, in his old conception, also has a lot more agency over his own agenda. He wants to eat, he wants to consume, he wants to kill, but he's not, insofar as we can see, he's not really slave to the will of the Void in the same way that more modern Void champions like Vel'Koz, for instance, is. Vel'Koz is also highly intelligent, but he's also an intelligence who is tied 110% to his only overriding mission, which is to learn about Runeterra and bring that information back to his masters in the Void. So, I don't know, he's kind of a difficult, he's kind of a square peg for a lot of round holes, as it were. Which leads us on to Cho'gath as an actor in League of Legends narrative, because here too, he makes for an awkward fit for some reasons that we've actually discussed before. He's an awkward fit in the narrative for the same reason that a character like Kog'Maw is, for the same reason that a character like Kha'Zix kind of is, for the same reason that a character like, even like Tahm Kench and Evelyn and Nocturne kind of are, but even more so. So Evelyn and Nocturne and Tahm Kench are all demons that are based around mortal fears. They're based around, some people like to conceptualize them in terms of the 7 deadly sins, but they are about expressing flaws and fears and foibles that are present within humans themselves. Tahm Kench is greed, Evelyn is lust, Nocturne is fear, and so on. So if you put another character up against any of those three, then that presents us an opportunity to explore the hero of the story, which is what like a lot of good monster stories tend to do. They tend to be about the main characters confronting some aspect of themselves. If you think of a game like Silent Hill 2, where the entire village of Silent Hill is about reflecting James Sunderland's neuroses and fears, and all of his flaws and all of his self-hate is reflected back at him in the shape of the various monsters that he encounters over the course of that game. And the same idea is essentially present in a character like Tom Kench, whose power over other people is entirely about the extent to which he can manipulate them into giving into their greed. Evelyn's power over other people is entirely up to the extent to which she can manipulate them into giving into their lust. Nocturne's power is about the extent to which he can manipulate them into giving into their fear. But all of them have power that is based on the personal attributes of whatever opponent they're going up against. That makes them kind of hard to tell stories about all on their own because they are about other people's characteristics, right? But it makes them really good antagonists in stories because every time anyone encounters one of these enemies, it's an opportunity for the victim to grow as a person unless they get killed. Like, if they survive, then they will have overcome some flaw within themselves. Cho'gath, on the other hand, is not really a reflection of you as an opponent that he's up against. He's not really a reflection of anything but his own internal gluttony, his own internal desire to consume. So Cho'gath, in a narrative, the only story you can really tell about Cho'gath is he goes to this place and then he finds some way to eat stuff. Because it's his only motivation, it's the only thing he wants. He can't grow as a character, he can't really change as a character, he can't develop a new understanding of himself or his place in the universe, which means that it's really hard to position him as anything other than as an antagonist in other people's stories. And there, like, unless you want to do like a really subversive messing around with the tropes kind of thing, inevitably you're positioning him as an antagonist, whereas like, either you beat him, or you escape, or you die. And these are the only three possible outcomes of an interaction with Cho'gath. And he could be used as a metaphor, like a representation of metaphor in other people's narrative, like someone who has to deal with their own gluttony, their own tendency to use others for the purposes of their own power, I suppose. That's like, I guess you could do that. But it's an awkward fit because Cho'gath is just a monster in a lot of ways. Like, he just wants to kill and hurt and maim and eat and consume and be evil. So as a protagonist, I don't really think it's interesting or worth telling a lot of stories about him. At least not within the auspices of the ways in which League of Legends tells stories right now, because like right now the storytelling in League of Legends is essentially just a series of short vignettes with no longer overriding story arc sort of informing them. Like, even characters like Akali, who received like a time skip kind of character updates, like, there isn't really a long-running storyline in which you might be able to develop a awkward fit character like Cho'gath into something that makes sense. Like, Cho'gath would have to be developed into a character in the same way that Venom in Spider-Man was developed into a character, beginning its life as essentially just kind of a metaphor to expand upon the "with great power comes great responsibility" theme that's inherent to Spider-Man by tempting him into becoming selfish once again, like essentially repeating his primary character challenge. That's all the Venom symbiote was in its most iconic storyline, although I know it began in Secret Wars as like an alien suit power-up for Spider-Man that then eventually got reconceptualized. Comics are weird. We don't want to talk about comics lore right now, but Venom essentially had to have this very long process of like bonding with Eddie Brock and becoming sort of its own character with its own personality and morality, and transcending a little bit its original conception as a thing that just wants to eat and consume and do, you know, the biological necessities of existing, into this thing that has agenda, personality, that can interact with other people, that has some kind of narrative arc to it. And it had to do that by interacting with Eddie Brock, who also had to have a bunch of character arcs of his own to sort of give Venom any kind of a personality. Cho'gath would have to go through something like a similar process where there is this like long process of recontextualizing him into something else in order to really make him work. Outside of, this is me talking outside of just doing a complete reboot of the character and changing every aspect of him until he becomes useful. If you wanted to do that if you wanted to tell ongoing stories about Cho'gath with him as a protagonist or antagonist or deuteragonist or anti-villain or whatever, it would have to be this long-running process that the state of League of Legends lore right now just doesn't really seem to support at all. Like, first of all, because they're still extremely busy just updating the League of Legends universe to fit the modern conception of the lore, a process that they are not at all finished with and probably won't be for another couple of years at least. And also because so far Riot really hasn't proven itself willing to engage in that kind of extremely long-term publishing planning, and I'm not sure I blame them. Anyway, the only way for me to really talk about Cho'gath in interesting ways is to bring it to this highly conceptual level of his place in League of Legends mythology, because as a character himself, as we've already touched on multiple times, he's not that interesting. There's really not that much to him, which is why I keep advocating that we turn him into a demon instead, because then maybe, like we do with Tahm Kench and Evelynn, we can use him as a reflection of the characters that he goes up against. We can use him as a metaphorical opponent that tests the people that he goes up against on their ability to resist their gluttony in some... Like, maybe there's something there. Whereas, as just the consuming evil void demon that he is right now, he doesn't... I don't know what you do with him except plop him into a story, have him fight someone, and then nobody dies because you can't kill either character in the interaction. Now, that's the other problem that League of Legends will always have, is that people can fight Cho'gath, but they can never kill Cho'gath. And Cho'gath can fight other champions, but he can never kill them and eat them. Which, like, when the whole character's point is to kill and eat, and the only way to really reject that in a narrative sense, like to fight that in a narrative sense, is to kill him, well, he's awkward. He's in an awkward spot. I don't really know what you would do with him. So, anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, well, you should feel very free to hit the like button down below. There's also a comment button or comment field. You can click the buttons on your keyboard, and then a comment will magically appear saying things to me, which I will read. You can do that. You can also, if you are so inclined, you can head on over to Patreon, where you can support the channel with anything. Like, if you have $1 a month, I would be very grateful to receive that, because it genuinely does help me and people like me out a lot. So if you have a creator that you want to support, Patreon is a great place to do it. You can also subscribe to the channel, and then the bell icon, which you have to subscribe and then the bell icon. Otherwise, you don't actually subscribe. Maybe. I don't know. Who the hell knows at this point? If you haven't liked this video, then, you know, there's a dislike button that you can click on, I suppose. And, you know, that dislike button probably is not a crack between the dimensions leading into an alternate state of existence where the rules of physics do not apply, and where if any human were to enter that dimensional rift, they would be instantly abstracted into their constituent parts, rendered into a formless consciousness drifting forever through the eternity of the between world, able to perceive the world around them, but never able to interact or make any changes, able to observe the passing of eons, the rise and fall of centuries, slowly driven, completely mad, and completely absent of any soul or empathy by countless eternities of simply being trapped in a nothing state and watching the rest of the world happen, powerless and eternal. And then, through some accident, be thrust back into the physical world, changed and destroyed, and unable to truly occupy a human form, yet forced to live in a human body that cannot no longer contain the cosmic consciousness that you have become. Probably that's not... I mean, it seems unlikely, right? Thank you very much for watching.